PlayStation 3. What a wild ride this one was. I want to know, for the people that grew up with it, how was it? What was the perception at the time? What was the word of mouth going around about the PS3? Did a lot of people like it? Or was it hated, and did it grow on people? Was it impressive or disappointing? I'm curious, because I wasn't paying attention at the time. I was too young, and I was stuck on the Nintendo consoles. I ultimately got a PS3 in 2014, after the PS4 already came out, just to play Plants vs. Zombies Garden Warfare free online. I didn't want to pay for Xbox, and at that time, I had no knowledge of PC gaming. The PS3 was the only way to play it online for free that I knew about. But it was great because this introduced me to the world of video games outside of Nintendo, and then led me to PC gaming as well as the PS4 Pro. So I have really good memories of the PS3, even though I got to the party very late. On paper, though, it seemed like a really impressive console for 2006. It came with Wi-Fi on the higher end model, an internal hard drive, and I know the original Xbox had it as well, the PS2 and PS1 backwards compatibility, the second console into the HD generation, introducing HDMI to console gaming for the first time alongside the Xbox 360. These consoles were the transition between CRTs and flat panels like plasma and LCD, and the first real exposure people got to HD content, with Blu-ray releasing just a few months before the PS3 did. And that was a huge thing. The PS3 was a Blu-ray player just like the PS2 was a DVD player, and it was actually significantly cheaper than other Blu-ray players at the time, where they could be over $1,000. The PS3 was $600 or less. Now, $600 and $500 if you didn't want the Wi-Fi, which seems a little inconvenient, but I guess you could have saved a couple $100, but then you also lost the hard drive capacity. That's a very expensive console. But compared to high-end home media entertainment devices, which this could do with SD cards, flash drives, DVDs, CDs, Blu-rays, the new format that looks excellent, this thing actually, to me, doesn't seem like a too bad of a price, even at the original $600. Obviously not a kid's console at that point. It'd be hard to justify buying it for a minor, especially because a lot of the games are rated M anyway, so I feel like this was more targeted towards the teenagers and the adults that could afford it. It was a mature console, you could say. Now, obviously, that's not true. All ages can enjoy these games and enjoy the console, but maybe that's what Sony was thinking, and it was prohibitive for a lot of people. But nonetheless, over the generation, the PS3 became a very successful console, and it fixed a lot of the mistakes. But they were really trying to push technology really far with this console. The PlayStation 3 is powered by the Cell Broadband Engine, a 64-bit CPU co-developed by Sony, Toshiba, and IBM. It includes a 3.2 GHz PowerPC-based PPE, power processing element, and 7 synergistic processing elements, SPEs. So, you can kind of think of it as an 8-thread processor, but not really. More like the one PPE is like a standard core in other CPUs. And then the secondary SPEs were meant to do other tasks that the big CPU core assigned them, but they were not full cores. But this is what made the PS3 incredible, as well as very difficult to program for. It was initially designed that these smaller cores would actually do a lot of the graphics and processing power, but then Sony realized that they do need a GPU because the development would have been too difficult and there probably wouldn't have been enough power there to realize many games. So they settled on the RSX reality synthesizer developed by NVIDIA, running at 500 megahertz. It had 256 megabytes of RAM bus XDR DRAM at 21 gigabytes a second, 256 megabytes of GDDR3 at 21 gigabytes a second. This was kind of the problem, is the memory was separated between CPU and GPU and it had to switch places a lot. But for an overall total of 512 megabytes. That seems really low, especially compared to modern architectures. But if you look at it compared to the older consoles, the PS2 had 38 megabytes, which means this was 13 times as much memory, and even 8 times as much as the original Xbox. So this was vastly, definitely a proper console generation bump. Yeah, but who cares about all the specs and it being a Blu-ray player and stuff? It's a console. It needs to play games. What about the games? And we have much highs and lows in this generation. This was the generation where HD became normal. You got a lot of PS2 remasters like Shadow of the Colossus, running at a significantly higher resolution, which was a fun experience to take advantage of your new HD TV. And because the PS3 kept up with hardware specs with the Xbox and for how successful it was and how successful the PS2 was, it got incredible third-party support. It basically got everything the Xbox 360 did in terms of third parties. You got your Call of Duties, your Maddens, your Assassin's Creeds, Batman, whatever it may be. This was one of the major players this generation. And unlike the Wii that I talked about last time, this actually kept up with the console generation and was a huge leap forward. But more importantly, for a console, I would argue, is the first-party games. Sony, I would say, did an excellent job. You have 2 Gran Turismo games, Gran Turismo 5 and 6, and sim racers love this game, as well as just, it's one of Sony's headline titles, always pushing graphics and technology forward, as well as just being a dense game that has a lot of content to it. And then of course you have the Uncharted trilogy, which is incredible to think about how we got 3 Uncharted games and The Last of Us for the PS3, all by Naughty Dog. And these were excellent games that are world renowned, everyone knows what they are, they're fun action adventure games, and they got a remaster on PS4. But it started here. You got God of War, and so many more games that I can't tell you all everything. And I don't want to leave anything out that people might remember. So, let's just say Sony produced many games. But because it was also a Japanese company, Sony, you get a lot of those Japanese games. This is the console that you probably wanted if you wanted JRPGs, such as Final Fantasy and Tales of Exilia, and many, 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 many more, like Persona and stuff like that. This was basically the home for the Japanese developed HD games, and it did a great job at that. The Blu-rays really helped too, because you almost always just had the game on the disc, versus Xbox 360 sometimes had to download stuff or came with 2 discs that you had to install. The PS3 was actually pretty good at running most games off the disc. And Blu-rays are more scratch resistant, which is another benefit of them. I loved the PS3, but looking back, how was the performance? How was the resolution? How was the frame rates? That, I think, is actually the big problem with the PS3, as well as a lot of games this generation. A lot of third-party games, because of the difficulty of developing for the cell processor, ran worse on the PS3 than the Xbox 360, or just looked worse, or both. This was also the generation of most games not even hitting 30 FPS. You got the GTA games, you got the Call of Duty games not even hitting 60, and even Gran Turismo, their headline titles, struggled to hit their 60 FPS target. And because of that, a lot of games actually ended up dropping the resolution significantly. There was a couple 1080p games on the PS3, but very far and few between. And even games like Gran Turismo 5 and 6 that support 1080p decently well, there's a little bit of upscaling, but it's mostly 1080p. At 1080p, they drop frame rates pretty low into the 40s or even lower. So most people actually say for most of these games, run it at 720p, let your TV do the upscaling, because a lot of games actually ran better at 720p anyway. But it was still great to see all the wonderful third-party support, the Japanese support, Sony's efforts on bringing so many wonderful games to this console that continued franchises farther into the future, as well as being a fun media device. I personally know a lot of people that use the PS3 as a Blu-ray player and a Netflix device. So, I mean, that's not really what you want a console to be, but hey, it sells, right? Overall, compared to modern technology, the PS3 is nothing revolutionary. And in fact, if you're going to be nitpicky, it's pretty bad. There's a lot of dropped frames, there's a lot of poor image quality. But if you just take it as its merit from 2006 and keep your expectations in check, there's so many wonderful games, and the games actually look just fine, as long as you're not trying to compare it to a nice 4K modern console. The PS3 did so many things right and pushed technology so far forward that basically everyone copied them anyway. They introduced Blu-ray to the console market. It had Wi-Fi, it had a hard drive, it had a honestly extremely powerful CPU and a of-the-era GPU, with enough memory at the time, and even though it was expensive, a reasonable price. This kind of was a pro console before we got the PS4 Pro and PS5 Pro. They just didn't release a base model. This kind of was the does everything console originally. And the gamers had nothing to complain about because the quality and quantity of games were endless. Objectively, a lot of people say this was the golden era of video games, of good quality, not too long of development cycles, and just so many iconic IPs are from this era. I think the PS3 is a very cool console. I plug it back in once in a while just to reminisce and to have some fun with some old games. But personally, I think I would get the PC versions of a lot of these older games, or the PS4 remasters of a lot of them. Which is funny because the PS3 is awesome, but a lot of the games just came right over. For example, Uncharted 1 through 3 got a PS4 version that's a lot better. Even Shadow of the Colossus got a remake on PS4. Last of Us, of course. There's new Gran Turismo games. I even think some of the God of War games made their way over. But I'm happy with what the PS3 was originally and what it gave me. I love this console, even though it has its issues. Unfortunately, I've already had 2 PS3s die on me. One was a yellow light of death on an original backwards compatible PS2 hardware PS3. And then the other one just slowly started crashing during gaming. So I ended up getting a PS3 Slim, and those improved reliability significantly. But you give up a lot. You give up all the USB ports and the ports, and you give up the PS2 compatibility. That was unfortunately quickly phased out to lower the cost. Which is truly unfortunate because I thought that was one of the main things that the PS3 did right, was backwards compatibility. I think it did a great job at it. And the emulation version on the original PS3 after they got rid of the hardware, not perfect. There's a lot of games that crashed or had issues. And here's a funny thing too. The PS3 was the last PlayStation developed by the Japanese version of Sony instead of the American. The PS4 and PS5 have been more led by the American sector of PlayStation, not the Japanese side. And it shows because there's some wonderful, awesome technology, but also some scary decisions that could have ended up proving bad for them. But ultimately it worked out. The PS3 was a good success, even though it wasn't as successful as the PS2 or the Wii. It still beat the Xbox 360 at the end, even though they were basically neck and neck the whole time. And I think a lot of people enjoyed their PS3, even though there was a lot of growing pains this generation. I really like the thing, but I don't think I'm the expert on the PS3. I didn't grow up with it. It was kind of later in my life. But it was still cool to look back on, and it was actually, to be honest, my first HD console as well. I wasn't spoiled by the PS4 because I didn't get the PS4 till later anyway. What was your guys' experience with the PS3? Let me know your stories and what your perception was at the time. I still think it's a pretty neat console.